And now, let's welcome on stage Qing Ze, Head of Product at Tribe, my lovely friend. Let's go into the stage with the workshop, Leading Spacetime Overcoming Inertia to Build in Web3. Welcome, Qing Ze.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so how do I use this again?
Click on the green button.
Oh wait, this is a bit different from the slides that I have. Could you update the slides that I prepared? This is a different set. Yeah. But anyway, I'll take some time while they prepare the slides. It's in the Telegram, you can pull it out from there. Yeah. So today I'll be talking a bit about growing developer ecosystems, primarily about a very simple concept like I introduced, which is about the idea of looking at ecosystems and communities as different planets and have their own kinds of gravity and their own kinds of orbits. So I'm Qing Ze and I work at the Tribe. And what we do is we grow ecosystems, primarily developer ecosystems. There's a bit of a distinction in my mind, and hopefully by the end of this presentation you might agree, that communities and ecosystems are actually somewhat different things. If you look at biology, right, communities are collections of populations, populations are collections of individuals, and ecosystems are collections of communities. So generally when we look at developer communities and developer ecosystems, an ecosystem can be made up of not only developers, but also lawyers even. If you remember what happened at Tornado Cash, it could involve product people, it could involve marketing, and it's these different communities that may look disparate and eventually come together to grow its own ecosystem. So I'm going to try and make sure my slides are the right ones, because I think I sent an old deck last time, so sorry for that. Yeah, so today what I intend to share a bit about is a general philosophy of growing communities and ecosystems, primarily about bringing developers from Web 2 to Web 3. Even though Tribe works with quite a fair amount of different ecosystems, I think the core of Web 3 is really centered around its developers. I was watching the presentation earlier by the professor, and it's absolutely right. I think if you want to grow a decentralized community, it is highly dependent on the kinds of builders that you attract, the kind of ethos that you want to foster and facilitate, and that will grow into the kinds of work that you actually create more value. I am no decentralization maxi, but I think that decentralization is really the heart of Web3. And since I'm in Vietnam, it's also the heart of Ethereum and as the Ethereum community. So, I know you can tell I'm kind of stalling for time, but maybe I'll share a bit about why I use the term lending Spacetime. And you will see later in the slides a very simple sort of like physics-inspired analogy of developer ecosystems. And really, if you look at all of us in a constellation of stars, right, and each star has its own kind of gravity, and developers are comets or meteors going around, then I think you can get a better idea of how one might attract developers or keep them within their own orbits. And I think that's a very simple analogy for fellow ecosystem builders or people that are part of communities and ecosystems. Okay, so this is the right deck of slides. Thank you everyone. Yeah. So very quickly, let's get some shared context about what's happening in Web3. This is actually the Electric Capital report that came out in 2021. Whenever I cite this number, most people don't believe it. Like, is there really only 18,000 monthly active developers? Like, there's more people in the trade, I think. Well, even if I 100x this number to 1.8 million developers, it's really just a fraction of the number of software developers worldwide. Less than 4% of the global number of software developers. This is probably testimony to the amount of growth that we have. And as you can see from a very Web 2 set of slides, there is 30 million software developers and growing. I think Vietnam contributes quite a fair amount every year, so thank you. And this also reminds us of the monumental tasks that we have ahead. I think a lot of us at the event here are either curious about Web3 or believe that Web3 is kind of inevitable and it will be a part of it. How many of you have, say, an ENS? So raise your hand. ENS. Okay, numbers are going up, so 5%. Who here has bought an NFT before? Okay, so NFTs really is quite a big thing. What about folks that have used decentralized exchanges like Uniswap or Kyber? It's quite a lot, yeah. So Web3 adoption, every time I do a talk, right, and even when I give presentations, every year you can more or less see this number actually double, which for me is quite interesting. We used to do sessions, meetups where nobody ever bought a single or ever interacted with Web3 before. And I think right now, we're at a really interesting moment where the value of Web3 as a decentralized coordination layer is starting to show with collapse of subsequent centralized exchanges. I think it's becoming very clear that the value of Web3 really lies in decentralization, and developers are the ones that are going to create. So I call this the developer gap. This is actually a very bad graph because if you look at the numbers, this should be 1,000 times smaller. But if I did, I think it would be the size of a pea and you can't really see anything. So how do you bring Web2 developers to Web3? Now, if I use the gravity kind of analogy, and I did engineering, so I'm a bit of a physics nerd. Developers are kind of within an orbit of their own ecosystems, their own communities, right? So imagine you're a Web2 dev, and you are orbiting around the Web2 community. You have a very high amount of inertia that makes it very hard to attract you to Web3. So a combination of a high amount of inertia. Now, when does this inertia come from? Right. When I studied engineering in SUTD in Singapore, right, I was taught Web2 tools. There was one Web3 course that I wasn't eligible for because I didn't take Python or was it JavaScript? I forgot. Right. So the amount of inertia to leave Web2 is extremely high, especially with the tools that you use, the habits that you have. Like how many of you wanted to quit Facebook and are still on Facebook? I still am, I find it really hard. A lot of friends are there, and a lot of family members are there, right? And so the kinds of communities that you build are very sticky. Web3 needs to have a higher amount of gravity to counteract the inertia that you already have. But more importantly, it needs to be attractive. And this is more than just like monetary salaries. I think what really helps sort of overcome inertia is a sense of community. So everything that I do kind of centers around that. Now, if you were to map out like different communities that make up general ecosystems, you will probably think it looks like this. Right, with like different orbits, different planets, different places that will attract you to different communities. But actually, I think it looks more like this. And there are different communities that have much more institutional power, for example. When we grow developer communities at Tribe, I think we notice that there are generally 2 or 3 really large sources of potential developers. So one, naturally, is from universities, and that is actually constrained by population. So Singapore only has like 4 to 5 universities, and this means that we produce maybe at most like 2,000 developers a year, or 2,000 people that are kind of prepared to learn development, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they actually join the technology industry, and even lesser when it comes to Web3. We found that during COVID actually, quite a lot of people are coming from other industries, through like developer academies, coding boot camps, and somehow they tend to converge around career fairs and like meetups and organizations. So this is the global, or at least maybe you can think of it as like a global universe of like developer experiences. Now Web3 is really just one small element of it. I put it near games because I know Vietnamese devs tend to work in GameFi quite a lot, so this should be quite accurate. But a lot of developers also enter other industries like AI, for example, or just general web development. So you imagine that actually getting developers to join the ecosystem is really actually very difficult. But Web3 is not just one block. There's Ethereum ecosystems where learning, for example, StarkNet requires a completely different language. Some of you might have realized. It's called Cairo. I tried to understand it and I failed miserably at it. Everything else may or may not be EVF equivalent, and they have their own bits of quirks, different tooling, different activities, different communities. And that's just Ethereum. I mean, there's Cosmos, for example. There's Polkadot. There's different standalone chains, the Solana. Each of these different chains have their own sets of developer communities and developer tooling. And most importantly, a different sense of belonging when you enter these ecosystems or communities. And so, here lies the challenge. Not only is it difficult to bring developers that have a high amount of inertia to a completely new ecosystem, to almost relearn everything that they have learned. I remember when I first joined Web3, everything seemed so confusing. Like, why do I need to get test Ether to do anything? This makes no sense. I should be able to just run it locally. And eventually it became possible. But I guess maybe tooling was already at the front. And as time goes by, things should get easier. But we're not there yet. Now I have a question for everybody. And this sort of puts forth a certain dichotomy between community and ecosystems. Do you consider yourself a community builder or an ecosystem builder? So, community builders, raise a hand. Okay. What about ecosystem builders? Okay, interesting. So I noticed some professors consider themselves ecosystem builders, and I recognize some of you, so developers tend to find yourself as community builders, and I think that is actually quite accurate. But I'll be focusing a bit more on communities. But let me explain the difference here. So, open source communities have been the heart of keeping open source software alive for about 20 years already. So the history of open source is actually quite brutal, mostly because of a lot of large tech conglomerates that use a lot of different resources to try and crush open source communities in favor of proprietary software. And naturally, these open source communities need to band together to try and keep the spirit and philosophy alive. And so communities are generally characterized by common ethos and a common sense of belonging. So when you go for meetups, when you meet your friends, when you do code along, pair alongs, when you come to teach, when you do mentoring, these are all community activities. Now, ecosystem activities are actually very different. Ecosystems are different communities that have to play together, whether they like it or not. So this is interesting, right? Because, like, for example, the regulatory community will have to work with the decentralized finance community, right? Naturally, because they are part of the overall ecosystem that we call society. And so the challenges that ecosystem builders face are actually very different. But I'd like to take some time to highlight that because actually we are all part of larger ecosystems and we cannot ignore it. For this event, not so much. But when you go around different Ethereum events, you will notice that there will always be a different chain running a house, running their own hackathon. And these are all parts of different Web3 ecosystems. As Aya mentioned in the presentation earlier, the Ethereum's philosophy of infinite knowledge kind of keeps things very open, and so we are, I wouldn't say tolerant, but almost welcoming anybody interested in growing their own developer communities. But that's the reality of it. So, this is supposed to move, but this is actually a screenshot from DevPost, and I'm going to spend the rest of my talk explain or maybe providing some insight into hackathons. Now, it is my bread and butter at Joy. We run hackathons almost every other week as part of Angel Hack. And when you look at, for example, DevPost or like ETH DevPost alone has like 376 hackathons at them, ranging from prize monies that range from I think $0, not sure why, but all the way up to $1 million in prize money. And for some reason, Web3 communities all decided to converge on doing hackathons. every chain that we've spoken to, every project, every event, will always run a hackathon on the side. My theory for this is that I think thematically, developer communities need an excuse to leave their home. And hackathons are a good way to justify to your boss that you're learning something and you might win money on the way and get some prestige. But over the years, I think it has changed. Hackathons have become very different. So I'd like to propose a very simple taxonomy of hackathons. These are the kinds of hackathons that we try to run because I think it brings the most value to your ecosystems. And if you like, you could maybe emulate some of these ideas. But one thing underpinning all of these programs is a sense of intentionality. So when you run hackathons, you must have a clear sense of purpose. And I'd like to propose that there are generally three kinds of purposes that I think developer communities enjoy a lot. And the nuance of running these hackathons are subtle, but very significant. So the first kind of hackathon, I call them education hackathons. And really the core idea of this is to lower the barrier of entry with rewards and make learning extremely accessible. Now what does this mean? Now remember the whole analogy about Web 2 and Web 3 and the high amounts of inertia? Well, getting developers to come for hackathons, that's actually one challenge. Having them confused during a hackathon, and I think they'd rather go and eat pho and enjoy, right? So it'll be really different.
What the fuck?
Most hackathons are run with like, maybe you have 2 or 3 prizes, $5,000, and people try to compete to win these prizes. Education hackathons can be run very differently, almost like a mini learn and earn kind of experience. Instead of having everybody fight it out or to compete, a more collaborative spirit is generally recommended. I think having smaller tasks that developers can use to try to just simply attempt. Maybe if you launch your first token, that could actually be a very large gap that is bridged by new developers that people that are seasoned in the space have completely forgotten. And so educational hackathons are really designed that way. The second kind of hackathon is what I see the most in this space. My guess is because most hackathon budgets come from marketing. And they tend to be very social. And the goal of such hackathons is really to try and drive momentum. So if you look at Eve Global, for example, I'll use it as an analogy because I assume people are a bit more familiar with it. But Eve Global hosts about 6 hackathons a year. And they always pick them at very important moments, like at Dev Connect, DevCon, Eve NYC, Eve Network. These are all places that have a high amount of movement and mobility, and lots of people come down. And so social hackathons really shouldn't be too serious. And you will find that there is way too many side events. So, social hackathons, the whole purpose of that is to try and get to know people. And generally when I talk to the students that I work with and they go for hackathons of a social nature, they tend to get very nervous. Like, what if I don't win? What if I don't form a team? What if my project looks really silly? Honestly, just have fun. The point of social hackathons is to remind you that Web3 is not just about market sentiment or technology, but it's the people behind it. And if you run social hackathons, I think one thing that I really appreciate is the ability to interact with people that build the tools that you use. Like, it's a whole different experience to be using Hardhat, for example, and meeting a Hardhat called Dev. So at DevCon, when you talk to people that are Solidity devs, it's not that they code on Solidity, it's that they code and make Solidity. Meeting these people are a completely different experience, and it actually highlights a lot about each different ecosystem's specialities. For example, in Argentina, did you know the Open Zeppelin team are actually from Latin America? Like, meeting people that use such widely used tools provide the kinds of inspiration and social bonds that help overcome initial inertia. In the last kind of hackathon, I find to be mostly run by incubators and accelerators, or even like funds. I generally term them recruitment hackathons. Sometimes they could be hackathons, that concept is really quite similar. The idea here is to nurture good developers to enter an ecosystem, and they tend to be quite monetary in nature. This generally seems to work well when the ecosystem is already fairly established, and you will find that the kinds of developers that you attract are actually a little different. They tend to already know what they want, or they might already have projects that they are trying to pitch. So an example of this was one project that we ran for the Monetary Authority of Singapore. It wasn't recruitment, MES wasn't hiring, but it was a challenge to call different companies like Visa or Consensus to come up with a central bank digital currency that MES could take into consider. So such hackathons are actually really different. Rather than having a social nature or education, you mostly want to attract experts in the field already, so that the quality of discussions are actually pretty high, and it can be really intimidating. Now this works both ways. It makes your bosses look smart if they are there, so that works quite well also. But more importantly, the clash of ideas is what you want to have. And so good moderators kind of balance the tension is really important. If not, the communities will fray, and they would come to the next hackathon. So a very simple taxonomy of hackathons can give you a sense of different touch points that I think you might be familiar with, and provide a bit more insight into the kinds of hackathons that you're at. Hopefully next time when you go for one, in your mind you can already classify what kind of hackathon this is, and what kinds of goals and behaviors that can help you get the most out of the this. But really, this is more of a taxonomy of community touchpoints. Hackathons is just a single modality that I think we're quite familiar with. But if you look at it from sort of like a lineage kind of perspective, right? Hackathons are really just events that consolidate bounties and people. But you can also have hacker houses that consolidate more people and less of bounties. And along that spectrum, these are all different community touchpoints to try and grow developer communities. Now, I'd like to take some time to maybe share a bit about some interesting examples I've come across, and invite the crowd to maybe share some interesting community touchpoints that you've come across. Because I know this is supposed to be a workshop, but it feels like I'm in a board meeting. So, I don't know, we can try something and see how it goes, yeah? So, I'd like to start with one example that actually blends together all three of these different classifications. And it's a personal favorite of mine. Has anybody heard of Buildspace? No? Oh, okay, interesting. I thought they were quite popular. Buildspace started a year ago by Farza, who was from Y Combinator, and his initial project was to try and revolutionize K-12 education in America. COVID happened, so that was quite difficult. Instead, he decided to tap into Web3 and come up with self-serve projects where people would come on board, learn basic tools, very similar to education kinds of hackathons, right? But instead of giving out prize money, what people did was that they would get NFTs. And these NFTs serve as a form of credentialing. And you notice that there are some parallels to other hackathons. Like, I've seen the incubator say like, hey, I've managed to get the winner of an e-global hackathon to join my incubator. There is a big street cred to winning events like these. But what Buildspace did was very Web3 native, and I really appreciate it. A social element of the Buildspace community was sort of elevated, where they ran a Shark Tank kind of event or competition, or Dragon's Den if you happen to be from the UK. And what would happen is they invited the entire community to come together, something like a recruitment style kind of thing, to pitch their own projects. But instead of having a panel of judges, which is honestly logistically quite hard to run, they got the community to actually vote with the amount of NFTs that they had. And the number of NFTs that they had was kind of correlated with the amount of projects that they did, and therefore gave them a higher numbers of voting weight. I'd really like to see more types of projects that combine some of these ideas together, because it really spices up the kinds of events that we're at, and increases the amounts of participation that we have in the space. So this is one project that I'd like to highlight. I think I still have time. Okay, yeah, probably like 10 minutes left. So I'd like to take this time to maybe hear from some of the audiences. What are some like events that you have come across that you really enjoy? And we can maybe try out the taxonomy that we have, and we can see how this might play out. Yeah. I've never run a workshop like this before, so let's try. Anybody like to volunteer?
Please raise your hand and I will come to you.
Oh, yeah, that will help. Thank you.
Anyone?
Yeah, I guess I was at an event called Qing Ze House where they opened up a Hackathon and the idea was actually and then at the end, like you have judges who can give you feedback, and I think that would probably go into the educational section. Although there's probably areas in which you can like pitch that, so it's probably
Thank you. So I think Ito mentioned social house, which personally I classify it more as a social kind of hackathon initiative, right? I think a lot of it was about creating like really strong bonds, and I happen to know organizers, and that's actually their core objective, to grow the kinds of bonds that you don't usually get in events like this. Mostly because the way social house is designed, it was held in Dana. So a completely separate place from the city. In fact, I think we were 300 meters away from the ocean. So there's a lot of salt water. And the kinds of programming that Sozu House would run is generally loosely coupled and centered around family meals. Now this is interesting because very rarely do you see an event that is centered around creating a familial spirit. But I would imagine that family ties would have a very strong amount of gravity, right? So thank you, Ito. Oh yes.
Thanks very much, for bringing out the taxonomy. It really makes me very clear. I think now I understand why. I'm from Malaysia, so there's this hackathon organized by a bank, which was, the theme was metaverse, and I was wondering what is a bank doing? Sponsoring a hackathon, and then I understand that now with this it's very clear they're recruiting people to basically build a form of metaverse for their bank solutions.
Thanks, Jason. And that is absolutely true. We have run some hackathons for banks in Singapore also, and they are outright recruiting hackathons. In fact, they are designed to have a pressure cooker environment. Right? They really ramp it up, make it really difficult for people to project and to collaborate, or to work together and to collaborate. Mostly to just see how they fare. I don't usually recommend such a kind of hackathon for community building. Mostly because I think the key idea of events like this is to sieve out some sort of like elite developers. And events like this are good for certain kinds of more established communities where maybe it's a bit harder to find talent. Yeah, but as you said, like, banks tend to do events like this quite a lot. In fact, you will find that these events tend to be more and more common, but they are couched in more benign kind of like themes. So you will find like, I'm not naming names, I'm not necessarily saying that the organization does it like this, but for example, like UN, for example, does like maybe global challenges, right? Actually the UN has its own fund also, and they are trying to find talent, right, that they can use or that they can be a part of, or be a part of the UN family. Right? And those are usually run in a very distributed manner with minimal support. So once you see an event like this, you can kind of tell actually it's really a recruitment style hackathons. But there are more positive, less stressful ways of doing it, and more stressful and anxiety-inducing ways of doing it. Yeah. Thanks for your contribution. I think I still have some time. I can't really see. How much time do I have, by the way? Oh, yeah.
So I have a question. So you were talking about Web3 needs to build a larger gravity, right? Okay, in order to pull Web2, because Web2 has already such a huge inertia against it. What in your opinion must change or be better in your opinion when it comes to hackathons and stuff?
a really good question. So if I was to extend the gravity analogy and think a bit about how planets form, right? It all starts with a core, and more mass gets attracted to it, right? So how does that work in this space, right? I think hackathons are high effort but one-off. So if you move down one level, you need to have some sort of system to try and attract more mass into your community. And so actually smaller meetups are actually a really good way of growing communities that are overlooked. So maybe for some personal experience, right, I always try to show up for local student events because that's where you get talent that are kind of new and they are in between Web 2 and Web 3, right? So there's less inertia, and getting these talent into your gravity well or your community is actually a really good way of growing your own gravity, right? So different ecosystems have different strategies, but one key idea here is that it has to be consistent.
Alright, local meetups, got it. Thank you.
And one last point, I think, sometimes different organizations run meetups in a centralized manner. For example, say certain Ethereum doesn't do this, but Ethereum doesn't do this, but just giving an example. Sometimes like developer groups, like different projects might have say a HQ kind of style, and they try and get local students to run events in that way. What happens is that you end up with a kind of reliant structure, which doesn't lead to interesting projects like this, right? So not only do you have to run consistent events to grow mass of your community, like literally it's like a mass of your community, that's a very interesting analogy, but I digress. But giving these individual communities their own opportunity to coalesce in ways that make the most sense is actually key, and that sometimes requires a bit of subtraction and stepping back from power. Now you never know what kinds of constellations you will create. When you look at the universe, you see like binary stars, like two suns that revolve around each other. You might see gas giants. Different kinds of planets can and should exist, and they are good for different kinds of communities. And giving them a space to coalesce in ways that you might not expect will yield actually quite a lot of surprises. So I'm going to wrap up my talk to share a bit about Tribe. Naturally, I think it fits very well into the model that I presented. And the specific tactical activities that we do range from onboarding people through what we call learn and earn activities. Really, the core idea here is to de-risk learning. So rather than having you pay to learn, right? Actually, if you think about it, it makes more sense to have you get paid to learn because we are trying to attract you to a new community. And so we've come up with a model that kind of works. And boot camps. So generally boot camps, we run them through like scholarships. Naturally, I think that if you're trying to attract people into a community, they shouldn't have high barriers to entry, and financial means are one of them. Right? It's like trying to get a president or something. So once that exists, we engage them through like hackathons and hacker houses, and the same kinds of community touchpoints can be designed for different organizations also, depending on the level of maturity they have. But that's a whole different conversation. And finally, we don't term it recruitment. We consider them a building phase, right? Where good projects with good teams and high potential still need to be nurtured. And I like to caution against the factory analogy. I think the idea here isn't to stamp out more startups, but to give a space for startups to grow in a safe environment, which actually is very challenging in Web 3. I would reckon even more challenging than in Web 2. For many reasons, right? One, it can be very distracting. Two, I think there are certain risks that are actually hidden that requires a certain level of ecosystem context to help these communities navigate. And so that's what we do at Tribe EXO. And I hope you learned something from this presentation. And if you would like to ask any more questions, feel free to email me or follow me on Twitter. Even though my name is QZ, I'm a bit of a fan of Margaret's painting, so my Twitter is not _QZ. And I hope you enjoyed the talk. So thank you, and I'll see you around.
Thank Thank you, Qing Ze. Very glad to have you here. Okay.